Hi Warriors. This video is for U.S. history and we'll be covering the material on page 45 in your U.S. history booklet. We're going to talk a little bit today about the countercultural movements of the 60s and 70s. We've just finished a really brief and introductory discussion about the American Civil Rights Movement, which was in fact one of those countercultural movements also that spanned the 50s and the better part of the 1960s as well. But let's begin our conversation today by looking at that term, counterculture or countercultural. And let's dig into that a little bit and see what it means before we look at some of these groups that were active in society in the 1960s and 1970s. Counterculture refers to something that is going against the culture, okay? And when we think of the culture of a given society, there's typically a dominant culture. Everyone doesn't always agree on everything. Everyone always doesn't behave the same way. Everyone doesn't always agree on philosophy or politics or religion or economic practices. But usually there is a predominant idea that kind of dictates the way that society operates. So the first thing I want you to realize about counterculture, when we talk about a group resisting that majority culture, we're talking about a subgroup or a subculture. Within any culture, there is a dominant culture and there are typically subcultures also. It's a smaller culture of its own living within the overall larger culture or the dominant culture. So the first thing we want to understand about counterculture is we're talking about subcultures or subcultural groups. And maybe you're thinking of some groups right now that are smaller groups in our society that don't necessarily agree with the way society operates. They kind of do their own thing, okay? So we're talking about subcultural groups, or we're talking about a subculture living and operating within the larger or dominant culture. The second thing we want to understand about counterculture is that typically the philosophy of that subculture, the behavior of that subculture, the goals or aims of that subculture are different than the dominant culture. They don't fit in with the dominant culture. And so you can see immediately that there is potential for there to be some resistance and some aggression and some conflict. And this obviously very often happens when we have subcultures demonstrating or protesting against the larger culture. So counterculture refers to subcultures. Subcultures refer to groups whose philosophy or attitude or behavior typically doesn't fit in with the larger culture that exists or the dominant culture. And that subculture, the third thing I want you to understand is that subculture is usually trying to create a change within the dominant culture. Often the very existence of that subculture is an act of protest against the dominant culture in society. So those are some thoughts about counterculture. You can kind of come up with your own definition of what counterculture means, but those three elements are typically in play when we're talking about countercultural groups. Okay, now as we move on down your worksheet, the next group that we're going to look at, or the first group that we're going to look at, is the student movement. And what I'd like you to do in the little bit of space that I provided for you to write about each of these movements or these groups is to talk about a central figure or figures, someone who's in leadership perhaps in that movement. And then I want you to talk about a goal of the movement or maybe some action or activity of the movement. All right, and just 2 or 3 sentences is fine, but I want you to dig into some of this on your own, and I'll give you some direction along the way. So in the student movement, as far as central figures are concerned, I want you to look into 2 individuals, one named Tom Hayden, Hayden, and the other named Al Haber, Haber. And these 2 individuals are members of the Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS. So I want you to look into those two individuals, and specifically in terms of the goal or the action, I want you to look into, the date on this will be 1962, the Port Huron Statement. Port Huron Statement. And so look into those people and that statement, and that'll give you a little bit of information so you can write down what you think is important about the student movement in the 60s and the 70s. The next countercultural group I'd like to talk about are the hippies. And you have a picture in your mind, I'm sure, of, tie-dye t-shirts and bell-bottoms and sandals and long hair and wire-rimmed glasses and all kinds of things right now, peace signs. But let's talk about the hippies a little bit. This is going to be difficult for us to pull a central figure in terms of leadership forward, because this was a movement that was essentially leaderless. They were so concerned about not imitating the power structures that existed in society at that time that they didn't want to say, oh, let's start a group and let's have a president and let's have a secretary and let's have, whatever. And so they had a tendency not to have really strong leadership organizations within the hippie movement. So instead of, in this case, looking for a central figure, I want you to look to a time and a place. I want you to look at Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco, California in 1967, and look for something called the Summer of Love. And if you look up Haight-Ashbury, San Francisco, 1967, the Summer of Love, that will give you a lot of information in terms of what was going on with the hippies at the time and the hippie movement, and how it related to and how it was pushing back against the dominant culture at the time. The next organization I'd like you to look into is the movement I'd like you to look into rather, is the Women's Liberation Movement. And the central figure here that I want you to look at is Betty Friedan, and her last name is spelled Friedan. She was the first elected president of the National Organization of Women, sometimes referred to as NOW, N-O-W. And so look into Betty Friedan and the National Organization of Women, and I want you to talk a little bit about her as a person, and I want you to talk a little bit about what the goal or the action of this movement was in the 60s and the 70s. The next countercultural movement is the anti-war movement. And again, there were many, many people protesting against the war. In the 1960s, it was the war in Vietnam. And we'll, in our next lesson, when we talk about the Vietnam War and the New York Times versus the United States Supreme Court case, we'll talk about Vietnam a little bit more. But that was the war that was kind of prompting these anti-war groups or this anti-war movement in the 60s. And again, there wasn't necessarily a structured hierarchy of leadership, but the two people I want you to look into in terms of leadership in the anti-war movement kind of emerged in 1967 when the campaigning for the presidential election of 1968 began to unfold. And those two men were senators at the time, Senator Eugene McCarthy and Senator Robert Kennedy, who was the younger brother of John F. Kennedy, who had been president until he was assassinated in 1963. So these two presidential contenders get into the primary races, and they are a little different than the other presidential hopefuls because they are speaking out pretty forcefully against the war in Vietnam. So I want you to look specifically at what kind of leadership, what kind of pushback these two men gave at that time in society while they were running for president in 1967, 1968. The next countercultural movement is the American Indian movement, sometimes called AIM, A-I-M. And the three individuals who provided leadership, significant leadership to this movement that I'd like you to look into are George Mitchell, Dennis Banks, and Clyde Bellecourt. And so this was a movement that involved many, many different tribal groups joining together. And if you know anything at all, even the little bit that we discussed about how Native Americans were treated during westward expansion in this country, you know that if tribal peoples gathered together, they would probably have a lot to complain about in regard to the U.S. government. So I want you to look at those three individuals. You can look at events that happened at Wounded Knee in South Dakota. You can look at events that happened at Alcatraz, the famous island prison off the coast of San Francisco, California. But look first into those three men and the American Indian movement, and tell me what that movement was about and what their goal or goals were. The last countercultural movement that I'd like you to look at is the United Farm Workers Union. And this union was actually a joining together of two separate unions. And the central figure here that I want you to look into is Cesar Chavez. And look into Cesar Chavez, the United Farm Workers Movement, and I want you to write about him, his life, a little bit of what led him to be involved in this movement, and then talk also about their goals or their activities. We know that if they are a union, they are more than likely going to be standing up for workers' rights. We know that if it's a farm workers union, more than likely they're going to be standing up for farm workers' rights. And so this is an example of people working in agriculture, pickers and things like that, that were being treated pretty badly, didn't have a lot of security or guarantees in terms of their job, their working conditions, their levels of pay and things like that. So look into the United Farm Workers Union and Cesar Chavez, and that's the last group I want you to look into. Again, 2 or 3 sentences, talk about that central figure and their leadership, and then talk about the goals or activities of the group. That's it for this time. I'll see you in the next video.